In the vast and tangled tapestry of European history, few figures have sparked as much fascination, controversy, and frankly, a touch of unease as Joanna of Castile, better known by the nickname that haunted her in life and death, Joanna the Mad. But was she truly mad? Or was she a victim of political intrigue, the prejudices of her time, and, let's be honest, a family with a particular knack for drama? We dive into one of the darkest tales of Spanish royalty. Joanna's final punishment, a queen who, according to legend, ended her days walled up alive. Yes, walled up. It sounds like something straight out of a Gothic novel, but hold on, because the reality is even more complicated. And, as always in history, the truth twists between gossip, dusty documents, and the agendas of those who wrote the stories. To understand how a queen, daughter of the all-powerful Catholic monarchs, ended up in such a grim situation, we must go back to the days when Joanna was just an infanta with a promising future. Born on November 6, 1479, in Toledo, at the heart of Castile, Joanna was the third child of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, a couple who not only united two kingdoms but also put Spain on the map as a power to be feared. These were the days of the Reconquista, when the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula fought to expel the Muslims from the south. The days of the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, a decision that marked a turning point in Spanish history, and the days when Isabella and Ferdinand funded Christopher Columbus's voyage, which, unknowingly, opened the doors to the New World. In short, the Catholic monarchs were busy redefining the world, and Joanna grew up in the midst of that whirlwind. Joanna's childhood was not that of a fairy tale princess, with dreamy castles and endless banquets. The court of the Catholic monarchs was itinerant, moving from city to city to maintain control over a diverse and often rebellious kingdom. Joanna spent her early years in places like Valladolid, Segovia, and Toledo, in palaces that were more fortresses than luxurious residences. Stone walls, cold floors, and narrow windows formed the backdrop of her childhood, and though tapestries and carved furniture added a touch of splendor, life at court was marked by duty and discipline. Her mother, Isabella, was a warrior queen, always occupied with state affairs, from negotiating treaties with neighboring kingdoms to overseeing military campaigns against Granada. Her father, Ferdinand, was a political strategist who rarely stopped calculating his next move, whether in Aragon, Castile, or the courts of Europe. In this environment, Joanna and her siblings, Isabella, Juan, Maria, and Catherine, were raised with a mix of rigor and high expectations. From a young age, Joanna proved to be a brilliant young woman. Educated under her mother's direct supervision, she received a training that few women of her time could dream of. She learned Latin, the language of scholars, which allowed her to read classical and religious texts in their original form, from Cicero's works to the theological treatises of Saint Augustine. She also mastered French, Italian, and Portuguese, essential skills for a princess destined for a foreign marriage. These languages were not mere adornments. They were diplomatic tools, and Joanna wielded them with a fluency that impressed the ambassadors who visited the court. She played the clavichord and the vihuela, instruments that reflected her refinement, and her performances, according to chroniclers, were delicate yet laden with emotion, as if each note told a story. Additionally, she had a solid knowledge of history, theology, and philosophy, disciplines that Isabella deemed crucial for her children, even for daughters who, in theory, would not rule. Joanna's education was not just a luxury but a strategic investment, designed to make her an attractive candidate in the European marriage market. Joanna's religious devotion was another trait inherited from her mother. Isabella was known for her piety, and Joanna grew up attending daily masses, praying the rosary, and studying pious texts. She spent hours in the chapel, often kneeling at a wooden prie-dieu, murmuring prayers in Latin with an intensity that sometimes puzzled courtiers. This devotion, though common in 15th century Castile, would later be interpreted as a sign of instability, especially when combined with her passionate nature. But in her youth, this religiosity was seen as a virtue, a reflection of the faith that underpinned the Catholic Monarchs project, a unified kingdom under the cross. Physically, Joanna was not the typical beauty of courtly chronicles, but she had a peculiar charm. Descriptions from the time speak of a young woman with fair, almost translucent skin, chestnut hair that fell in soft waves, and expressive eyes that seemed to reflect both intelligence and a certain melancholy. Some said she had her mother Isabella's piercing gaze, but with a touch of vulnerability that made her seem more human, less untouchable. In a court where appearances were everything, Joanna stood out not for ostentation but for her intensity. Chroniclers noted that, while not vain, she took care of her appearance with a sober yet elegant style, favoring dark velvet dresses with discreet embroidery and jewelry that reflected her rank without falling into extravagance. Her bearing, they said, was regal, but there was something in her movements, a slight restlessness, perhaps, that suggested a mind always at work. Those who knew her closely spoke of a soft but rare laugh, as if reserved for moments of genuine joy, something that would become increasingly scarce over time. The environment of the Castilian court where Joanna grew up was a microcosm of power and ambition. Nobles, always alert to opportunities for advancement, watched the Catholic monarch's children as potential allies or pawns. Ladies-in-waiting, many of them daughters of influential families, competed for Queen Isabella's attention, while clerics and royal advisors, with their black robes and parchments, debated politics, religion, and the next war. Joanna, though an infanta, was not exempt from these dynamics. From a young age, she understood that her life was destined to serve her parents' interests, and her education was designed with that purpose in mind. Yet she also showed an insatiable curiosity, asking questions about the books she read or the maps she saw in her father's meetings, which sometimes puzzled courtiers who expected more submission than intellect from a princess. But, as was customary at the time, Joanna's destiny was not to rule or shine on her own merits but to be a piece in Europe's diplomatic chessboard. The Catholic monarchs were masters of strategic marriages, and Joanna was no exception. At 16, in 1496, she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip of Austria, son of Emperor Maximilian I and heir to the powerful House of Habsburg. The decision was not random. The Habsburgs were one of Europe's most influential families, controlling vast territories in the Holy Roman Empire, and a marriage with Philip would secure an alliance against France, Castile, and Aragon's eternal rival. But sending Joanna across the continent was not just a matter of politics. It was also a logistical and emotional challenge. The journey to Flanders was an odyssey. Accompanied by a fleet of ships and a retinue of Castilian nobles, Joanna crossed the Bay of Biscay amidst storms that tested her resolve. The superstitious sailors murmured that the raging waves were a bad omen, but Joanna, according to accounts, remained composed, praying in her cabin as the waves battered the hull. The journey took weeks, with stops in French and Flemish ports, where locals observed the young Infanta with curiosity as she arrived to marry their Archduke. When she finally disembarked in the Netherlands, the Flemish court received her with a splendor that contrasted with the sobriety of the Castilian court. Flanders was a hub of luxury, art, and politics, where banquets lasted days, nightly tournaments with a star entertainment, and the ladies' dresses seemed to compete with cathedral-stained glass. But it was also a court rife with intrigue, where nobles had their own agendas, and a young foreigner like Joanna could feel, at best, out of place. The meeting between Joanna and Philip was, according to chroniclers, love at first sight. Philip, known as the Handsome, didn't earn that nickname by chance. Chronicles describe him as a man with a symmetrical face, golden hair that shone in the light, and a smile that, according to rumors, could melt hearts within a 10-meter radius. He was, in modern terms, the Renaissance equivalent of a Hollywood heartthrob, with a charisma that made him irresistible but also a reputation for being, let's say, a bit too fond of freedom. It's said that the two were so eager to meet that, as soon as Joanna disembarked, Philip insisted on holding the wedding immediately, without waiting for protocol ceremonies. The couple married in Liège in October 1496, in a ceremony that blended Flemish pomp with Castilian rigor. The banquets that followed lasted days, with tables laden with roasted pheasants, spiced pastries, and sweet wines, while musicians played melodies that echoed through the stone halls. At first, Joanna and Philip seemed genuinely in love. Joanna, who had grown up in a court where duty trumped feelings, let herself be swept away by the passion Philip inspired in her. He, for his part, seemed enchanted with his new wife, at least for the first few months. Chronicles describe horseback rides through the Flemish countryside, dances where Joanna, with her natural grace, stood out among the court ladies, and moments of intimacy that suggested a real connection. But this honeymoon wouldn't last long. Philip was handsome, yes, but also a bit, let's say, allergic to commitment. He loved parties, tournaments, hunting, and, above all, courtesans. In the Flemish court, where morality was more flexible than in Castile, Philip's extramarital adventures were an open secret. The court ladies, with their silk dresses and flirtatious laughter, didn't hesitate to approach the young archduke, and Philip, hardly a model of self-control, rarely turned them away. Joanna, on the other hand, was madly in love with him. And when I say madly, I'm not exaggerating. Chronicles from the time speak of an obsession that bordered on theatrical. Intense jealousy, public scenes, and a love that, by today's standards, we might call telenovela-level intense. For example, it's said that Joanna, in a fit of jealousy, cut the hair of one of Philip's mistresses, a gesture that scandalized the court but, at its core, reflects the pain of a young woman trapped in an unequal marriage. Another story, likely exaggerated, claims that Joanna spent nights guarding the door to Philip's chambers, fearing another lady might slip in. These episodes, though dramatic, were not uncommon in a context where women had little power to control their marriages, and where men, especially royalty, enjoyed freedoms their wives did not. Was this madness? Or simply a young woman, far from home, grappling with an unfaithful husband in a hostile court? Modern historians lean toward the latter. In the 16th century, women, especially royalty, were subject to relentless scrutiny. Showing strong emotions, especially jealousy or anger, was seen as a weakness, and in Joanna's case, her outbursts were recorded with a level of detail that suggests an agenda, to discredit her as a future queen. Moreover, the Flemish court was hardly a welcoming place for a Castilian. Local nobles saw Joanna as a foreigner, with her rigid customs and near-monastic devotion, and made little effort to make her feel welcome. The court ladies, many of whom competed for Philip's favor, didn't hesitate to mock the young Infanta, with her sober dresses and Spanish accent. Philip, who depended on these nobles to maintain his position, did little to defend her. In this context, Joanna's episodes seem more like a human reaction than a mental illness. Life in Flanders was not only an emotional challenge for Joanna, but also a physical one. Between 1498 and 1506, she gave birth to 6 children: Eleanor, Charles, Isabella, Ferdinand, Mary, and Catherine. The frequent and exhausting pregnancies weakened her physically, and the lack of emotional support in the Flemish court didn't help. Each childbirth was a risky event in the 16th century, with high mortality rates for both mothers and babies, but Joanna survived them all, demonstrating remarkable physical resilience. Her children, who would later occupy thrones across Europe, were largely raised by wet nurses and tutors, as was customary. But Joanna showed a special attachment to them, especially to Charles, her firstborn, who would one day inherit her rights to the throne of Castile. However, her role as a mother was limited by the demands of the court and the tensions in her marriage, adding another layer of frustration to her life. Life in Flanders also exposed Joanna to a cultural world vastly different from Castile. The Netherlands were a hub of the Renaissance, with painters like Jan van Eyck and sculptors filling churches and palaces with works of art. The markets of Antwerp and Bruges overflowed with spices, fabrics, and jewels from around the world, and the court's music was a spectacle in itself, with polyphonic choirs and musicians playing lutes and flutes. Joanna, with her refined education, appreciated this environment but also felt out of place. Her religious devotion, for example, clashed with the more relaxed attitude of the Flemish toward faith, and her refusal to participate in the court's excesses, like banquets that lasted until dawn, made her seem distant. Flemish chroniclers, who didn't understand her reserved nature, began describing her as strange, an adjective that, over time, would morph into something more sinister. Joanna's life took an even more dramatic turn in 1504 when her mother, Isabella the Catholic, died in Medina del Campo. Suddenly, Joanna became the heir to the throne of Castile, one of Europe's richest and most strategic kingdoms. Isabella's death was a shock to the entire family, but for Joanna, It meant something more. The responsibility of a kingdom she barely knew, having spent the last 8 years in Flanders. As the titular queen, Joanna had the right to rule Castile, but here's where the first major obstacle arose. Her father, Ferdinand, and her husband, Philip, weren't exactly thrilled about her taking power. Ferdinand wanted to maintain control over Castile, which he had governed alongside Isabella for decades, and Philip dreamed of being a king consort with all the power and none of the responsibilities. Together, they began weaving a narrative that would prove devastating for Joanna. The idea that she was unfit to rule because she was, supposedly, mad. The evidence of this madness was, at best, dubious. Ferdinand and Philip's allies compiled stories about Joanna's behavior, many of them exaggerated or taken out of context. For example, it was said that she refused to eat or sleep properly, spent hours praying in the chapel, or talked to herself in moments of distress. These behaviors, though unusual, weren't necessarily signs of insanity. They could have been the result of profound grief, court pressure, or simply Joanna's intense personality. But in an era when women were seen as inherently fragile, any deviation from the norm could be interpreted as a disease. The doctors who examined Joanna, many of them in Ferdinand's service, issued vague reports speaking of melancholy or mood disorders, terms that in the 16th century were more literary than scientific. The most famous episode, and the one that did the most damage to Joanna's reputation, occurred after Philip's death in 1506. Philip died suddenly in Burgos, likely of typhoid fever, though rumors of poisoning circulated among the nobles. He was only 28, and his death left Joanna a widow at 27, with 6 children and at the center of a power struggle she could barely control. According to chronicles, Joanna refused to part with Philip's body, carrying it from place to place in a funeral procession that lasted months. Sounds creepy, right? But if we dig a little deeper, the story isn't so simple. First, transporting royal bodies was common at the time, especially to ensure they reached their final resting place, in this case, Granada, as Philip had requested. Second, Joanna was pregnant with her 6th child, Catherine, when Philip died, and chronicles suggest her behavior was more a mix of deep grief and distrust of the nobles who wanted to sideline her from power than actual madness. The funeral procession for Philip, which began in Burgos and dragged on for months, was a strange but not unprecedented spectacle. Joanna insisted on traveling by night, with the coffin escorted by monks and torches, which fueled rumors of morbid behavior. However, this detail has a more practical explanation. Traveling at night avoided the daytime heat, which could decompose the body, and it was also a way to keep the procession solemn, away from curious crowds. Moreover, Joanna was surrounded by nobles who questioned her authority, and controlling Philip's body was, in a way, a means of asserting her position as queen. But the image of a queen dragging a coffin across half of Spain was too juicy to ignore, and her enemies used it to justify her exclusion from the throne. During this period, Joanna tried to govern Castile but faced formidable resistance. The Castilian nobles were divided. Some supported her as the legitimate queen, while others preferred Ferdinand, whose experience and cunning were well known. Philip, before his death, had tried to consolidate his own power, surrounding himself with Flemish advisors who clashed with the interests of Castilian nobles. This tension between the Flemish and Castilian factions further complicated Joanna's situation, caught between two worlds. In 1507, Ferdinand returned from Aragon to assume the regency of Castile, arguing that his daughter was unfit to rule. He convened the Castilian Cortes, where exaggerated stories about Joanna's behavior were spread, from her supposed obsession with Philip's corpse to her refusal to attend political meetings. In 1509, after a brief period in which Joanna tried to maintain some influence, Ferdinand made a drastic decision: to confine her in the castle of Tordesillas, a fortress in what is now Valladolid. And here's where the story turns particularly grim, because Joanna wasn't just locked away, she was practically erased from the world. The castle of Tordesillas was no summer palace. It was a robust structure with thick walls and small windows, more akin to a prison than a royal residence. Her rooms were cold, with stone floors and Spartan furnishings that contrasted with the luxury Joanna had known in her youth. The barred, narrow windows barely let in light, and the air inside the castle was damp and heavy, especially in winter. The smell of mold and burnt wax permeated the rooms, and the echo of footsteps reverberated in the empty corridors. Joanna, still the titular Queen of Castile, was isolated from the court, her children, and any meaningful contact with the outside world. Her only company were her guards, a group of men loyal to Ferdinand, some servants, and eventually, her youngest daughter, Catherine, who grew up practically as a prisoner alongside her mother. The guards, led by figures like the Marquis of Denia and his wife, had strict orders to limit Joanna's interactions. Any letter or message she tried to send or receive was intercepted, and visits were rare and tightly controlled. Even the priests attending to her spiritual needs were chosen for their loyalty to Ferdinand, not their compassion for the Queen. The Marquis of Denia, in particular, was known for his severity. Chronicles describe him as a stern-faced man with cold manners, who saw his task not as an honor but as a burden to be endured for the kingdom's sake. The living conditions in Tordesillas were, to put it mildly, deplorable. Chronicles describe Joanna living in increasingly small and neglected rooms, with scant furniture, a simple bed, a wobbly table, a couple of chairs, and hygiene that left much to be desired. Her diet was monotonous: stale bread, rancid cheese, some boiled meat, and watered-down wine, a far cry from the banquets of her youth in Flanders or Castile. The clothes provided were plain, often tattered, and in the harshest winters, it said she barely had enough blankets to keep warm. The servants, many of whom were more loyal to the guards than to the Queen, rarely cleaned the rooms, and dust and cobwebs accumulated in the corners. On the coldest days, Joanna wrapped herself in layers of old clothing, sitting by a brazier that barely warmed the chilly air. But the most disturbing aspect was the psychological isolation. The guards not only controlled Joanna's environment but also manipulated her perception of reality, telling her that her confinement was for her own good, that her illness required such treatment. They claimed the kingdom was at peace under Ferdinand's regency, and later Charles's, and that any attempt to intervene would only cause chaos. This manipulation was particularly cruel because Joanna, despite everything, showed moments of lucidity that unsettled her captors. In one instance, according to a 1510 report, Joanna demanded to see a court emissary, arguing that, as queen, she had the right to know what was happening in Castile. When denied, she responded with cold composure, "If I am not a queen, why do you treat me as such in your words but as a prisoner in your deeds?" This phrase, though likely not verbatim, reflects the clarity with which Joanna understood her situation, even in confinement. This is where the legend of the walling up comes in. According to some accounts, toward the end of her life, Joanna was literally sealed in a room with only a small opening to pass food and water. The image is so macabre it seems straight out of an Edgar Allan Poe story. But how true is it? Historians are divided. On one hand, there are no definitive documents confirming that Joanna was walled up in the literal sense. Records from the time, though scarce, mention her living in a series of rooms within the castle, not a sealed cell. For example, a 1530 inventory describes her lodging as a set of rooms with a bed, a table, and a small altar for her prayers. On the other hand, her confinement conditions were so extreme that they could be considered a symbolic walling up. Reports speak of a queen who barely saw daylight, who slept on a pile of straw at her lowest moments, and who, in her final years, barely spoke or moved. If she wasn't physically sealed in a wall, her existence was sealed in deliberate oblivion. To understand why it came to this, we must look at the men who controlled Joanna's life. Her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles, who inherited the thrones of Castile and Aragon and became Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Ferdinand had clear motives for keeping Joanna out of the picture. As regent of Castile, he controlled one of Europe's richest kingdoms, and yielding power to his daughter, even if she were perfectly capable, would have weakened his position. Moreover, Ferdinand was a cunning politician who knew that the madness narrative was a powerful tool to justify his actions. Castilian nobles, many of whom distrusted an Aragonese king like Ferdinand, could accept his regency if they believed the alternative was an unstable queen. To reinforce this narrative, Ferdinand ensured that stories about Joanna's behavior circulated widely, from rumors about the funeral procession to descriptions of her supposed melancholy. Charles, on the other hand, is a more complex figure. As Joanna's son, he had a filial duty to protect her, but as emperor, he had ambitions that extended far beyond Castile. Charles wanted to build an empire spanning much of the known world, from Spain to the Americas, from the Netherlands to Italy. To achieve this, he needed stability in Castile, and a mother claiming her right to the throne, even from a prison, was a threat. There's evidence that Charles visited Joanna in Tordesillas several times, but these visits were more inspections than displays of affection. In 1517, for example, he met with her to ensure she signed documents consolidating his power. According to accounts, Joanna was lucid during this meeting, denouncing the treatment she received and asserting that, as queen, she deserved respect. But her words changed nothing. Charles, pressured by his advisors and his own ambition, chose to keep her confined, ensuring her imprisonment was strict enough to prevent any possibility of rebellion. The treatment Joanna received was not only cruel but also deeply ironic. Here was a woman who, in her youth, had been educated to be a queen, who had given birth to future emperors and queens. Her children would rule Spain, Austria, Portugal, and the Netherlands, and who, by right, had the authority to govern one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Yet she ended her days as a prisoner in her own realm, watched by men who benefited from her marginalization. And the worst part is that, even in confinement, Joanna showed flashes of lucidity that challenged the madness narrative. Chronicles describe moments when she spoke clearly about her situation, denouncing her guards' abuse and asserting her right to the throne. On one occasion, according to a 1520 report, Joanna confronted the Marquis of Denia, asking why she was kept locked away if she had committed no crime. The Marquis, uncomfortable, responded with evasions, but the incident was recorded as proof that Joanna wasn't as mad as claimed. Life in Tordesillas wasn't just about physical isolation but also psychological manipulation. Joanna's guards, including the Marquis of Denia and his wife, were accused by some contemporaries of treating her with unnecessary harshness. For example, it said they forced her to attend Mass even when ill, dragging her through the castle's cold corridors to the chapel, where she had to kneel for hours. They also deprived her of food or clean clothing as a form of control, claiming it was necessary to discipline her. In one particularly disturbing report, it's mentioned that Joanna was bound and beaten on at least one occasion, supposedly to calm her after an episode of agitation. These measures, far from helping a supposed mental patient, likely contributed to her physical and emotional deterioration. The presence of her daughter Catherine in Tordesillas added another layer of tragedy to Joanna's story. Catherine, born in 1507 during the brief period when Joanna tried to govern after Philip's death, grew up in the castle, sharing her mother's confinement. Chronicles describe a dark-haired girl with large eyes, who learned to read and write under the guidance of the few loyal servants remaining. Despite the circumstances, Catherine developed a deep bond with Joanna, and the two spent hours together praying, embroidering, or simply sitting in silence. But this bond wasn't without tensions. Catherine, who grew up without knowing the outside world, sometimes grew frustrated with the isolation, and there are accounts of her arguing with her mother about their situation in her teenage years. When Catherine was separated from Joanna in the 1520s, likely to be prepared for a political marriage, the blow was devastating for both. Joanna, who had already lost her other children, was left even more alone, and chronicles describe a period of profound silence after Catherine's departure, as if something in her had broken. As the years passed, Joanna's health declined. Chronicles describe a woman who, in her final years, could barely walk, her body stooped and her hands trembling. Her hair, once her pride, was now tangled and gray, and her face, once expressive, had become pale and gaunt. Her voice, once clear and authoritative, became a murmur, and she spent entire days without speaking, sitting by a barred window, gazing at the sky or the Duero River flowing beside the castle. But even in this state, Joanna remained a figure who inspired fear. Rumors of her madness mingled with stories of her resilience, of how she refused to sign documents stripping her of her title, of how, in her moments of clarity, she spoke of her kingdom as if she still hoped to rule it. The revolt of the Comuneros, between 1520 and 1521, is a key episode that illustrates Joanna's political relevance, even in confinement. The Comuneros, a group of Castilian nobles and citizens discontent with Charles V's rule, rebelled against what they saw as a foreign king exploiting their kingdom to fund his imperial wars in Europe. They saw in Joanna a symbolic figure, a Castilian queen unjustly removed from the throne. Some rebel leaders, like Juan de Padilla, visited Joanna in Tordesillas, hoping to persuade her to lead their movement. According to chronicles, Joanna listened attentively, seated in a wooden chair in one of the castle's rooms, her hands folded in her lap. She expressed sympathy for their cause, acknowledging the difficulties Castile faced under Charles's rule, but refused to sign any document that would put her in direct conflict with her son. This act of moderation is revealing. Far from being a mad, irrational woman, Joanna showed political astuteness, aware that any misstep could worsen her situation and unleash more chaos in the kingdom. The defeat of the Comuneros at the Battle of Villalar in April 1521 marked the end of any hope of liberation for Joanna. Charles V, now firmly in power, tightened his mother's conditions in Tordesillas. The guards were replaced with even stricter men, and visits were reduced to a minimum. Even servants who showed too much sympathy for Joanna were dismissed or transferred, replaced by others more willing to follow orders without question. The castle, already grim, became even more oppressive, with less light, less food, and less human contact. Chronicles from this period describe Joanna as a shadow of herself, moving slowly through the rooms, often wrapped in a tattered cloak, her eyes fixed on the floor. But even in this state, she remained the queen, and her mere existence was an uncomfortable reminder for Charles and his advisors. Joanna's end came on April 12, 1555, when she died at 75, a remarkable age for the time, especially considering the conditions she endured. Her death was not a grand event. There were no majestic funerals or national mourning. She was buried quietly in Granada, beside her husband Philip, in the royal chapel, a place that symbolized both her greatness and her tragedy. The funeral was simple, with few attendees, and the cathedral bells barely rang. But her story didn't end with her death. For centuries, Joanna the Mad has been a symbol of tragedy, a reminder of how power, gender, and perceptions of mental health can conspire to destroy a person. Today, historians and psychologists revisit Joanna's case with a more compassionate perspective. Many argue she didn't suffer from any serious mental illness but was a victim of a system that punished women for showing emotions or ambitions. Others suggest that, if she did have mental health issues, they were exacerbated by the abuse, isolation, and betrayal she suffered at the hands of her own family. Some have speculated that Joanna may have suffered from severe depression or bipolar disorder, but without modern medical records, these theories remain just that, speculations. What is clear is that the madness narrative was a powerful political tool, one that allowed Ferdinand and Charles to justify her confinement while maintaining control over Castile. The legend of the walling up, though likely exaggerated, captures the essence of Joanna's existence. Whether she was literally sealed in a wall or not, her life in Tordesillas was a deliberate attempt to erase her from the world. Her isolation was not just physical but symbolic, a way to silence a queen who, despite everything, remained a threat. Because as long as Joanna lived, she was the legitimate queen, and any noble discontent with Ferdinand or Charles could, in theory, rally under her banner for a rebellion. This remote threat explains why her confinement was so strict and why stories of her madness were perpetuated with such zeal. Joanna's story has also inspired countless works of art and literature. In the 19th century, the Romantics, with their fascination for the tragic and sublime, found in Joanna a perfect muse. Painters like Francisco Pradilla y Ortiz captured her image in dramatic canvases, such as Joanna the Mad beside the bier of Philip the Handsome, a work that immortalized the legend of the funeral procession, with Joanna depicted as a tragic figure, draped in black veils, gazing at her husband's coffin under torchlight. Writers like Manuel Tamayo y Boss penned theatrical tragedies about her life, portraying her as a heroine trapped by love and fate. In the 20th century, Joanna appeared in films like Joanna the Mad, 2001, a Spanish production that, while taking historical liberties, captures the intensity of her personal drama, with scenes recreating both her passion for Philip and her confinement in Tordesillas. But beyond artistic representations, Joanna's story raises uncomfortable questions about power, gender, and perceptions of mental health. In an era when women were seen as inferior to men, the idea of a queen ruling in her own right was a threat to many. Joanna's emotional intensity, which today might be seen as a natural response to trauma, was used as an excuse to strip her of her authority. Her confinement was not just a personal punishment but a message to other women of her time. Aspire too much, and this could be your fate. In this sense, Joanna was not only a victim of her family but also of a system that valued male control above all else. Joanna's life in Tordesillas was also marked by small acts of resistance that, though subtle, speak to her inner strength. For example, it said she refused to wear the clothes provided by her guards, preferring old garments she mended herself, as a way of rejecting their authority. She also insisted on keeping a small altar in her room, where she prayed daily, despite the mockery of some servants. These gestures, though small, were a way of asserting her identity as a queen, even in the most humiliating circumstances. On one occasion, according to a 1535 account, a noble who visited Tordesillas was struck by Joanna's dignity despite her neglected appearance. "She is a queen even in her prison," he wrote, a phrase that encapsulates the paradox of her life. Joanna's relationship with her faith also deserves attention. In Tordesillas, her religious devotion intensified, but not always in the way her guards expected. While they wanted her to attend public masses to keep up appearances, Joanna preferred to pray privately, often for hours, kneeling before her makeshift altar. Her prayers, according to the few servants who observed her closely, were a mix of pleas for freedom and reflections on her fate. Some historians suggest this religiosity was a form of escape, a way to find solace in a world that had abandoned her. Others see it as a form of resistance, a way to keep her mind active and her spirit intact in the face of oppression. Ultimately, the legend of Joanna the Mad, whether walled up alive or not, is a powerful metaphor for her life. Whether she was physically sealed in a wall or trapped in a castle of intrigue, her existence was manipulated to be silenced. But her story has survived, not as that of a mad queen, but as that of a woman who, despite everything she faced, left an indelible mark on history. Her resistance was not an epic rebellion or a brilliant political maneuver but something deeper, the refusal to vanish completely, despite the efforts of those who sought to erase her. So, the next time you hear about Joanna the Mad, remember, behind the nickname, behind the legends, was a woman who, in her own way, fought against a world that wasn't ready for her. And that, my friends, is far more fascinating than any tale of walling up.